Fabiano Caruana steamrolls the entire field, winning 3 games in a row today, taking the sole lead with 15 points, and a 3-point lead over Wesley with 12 points, followed by Levon Aronian with 11, and a 3-way tie for 4th place with Alireza, Firouzja, Nepomniachtchi, and MVL. In round 7 of the Rapid event, Fabiano Caruana had the black pieces against Gukesh. The opening went d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, bishop b4. So this is actually a Rogozin, here with the pawn on d5 and bishop b4, not a Nimzo or whatever people like to call it. Queen a4 check, knight c6, and this is all theory played for a while. e3, bishop b2, bishop d6, routing the bishop back to d6. It's not really doing much here anymore now that there's no pin, and it makes more sense to support an e5 break here in the center. And black does play e5, d takes e, knight takes, bishop e2, saving that bishop, c6, knight d5, or knight d4, excuse me, queen e7, and knight f5. Gukesh is trying to pick up the bishop pair and fight for some sort of advantage here. So if black does not take, then I will take your dark squared bishop. So this is sort of forced. Queen takes f5, rook d8, only open file, castles, bishop c7, clearing the way for that rook, rook d1, and the brilliant move knight d3, which looks like it's hanging a piece, but actually after white takes on d3, the move g6 is played, and the white queen is not capable of defending the bishop on d3 anymore. So queen f3, rook takes d3, and what Fabi has done here is not only win the bishop pair back, but more importantly, gotten his rook very, very active on this weak light square and prepared to double the rooks on the only open file and create immense pressure. Queen e2, rook d8, bishop e1, a backwards move. I feel like a bad sign, but white does need to fight at least for the d file. Rook takes d1, rook d1, rook d1, and knight d1. My instinct was to play queen d1 and still have some sort of imaginary control over the d file. This knight d1 move is good, but to me, it feels wrong moving a piece away from the center, but I'm not good enough to understand it. So h5, b3, knight d5, g3, bishop e5. Okay, let's for a second compare these pieces to these pieces. Wow, they're fighting for the same squares, but both of white's pieces are on the back rank. The computer will tell you this is equal, but I would hate having this position as white because of how passive everything is and how great black's pieces are. So knight b2, bishop f6, knight c4. So now this isn't attacking anything, so b5 can be played. Bishop f6 was a little bit of prophylaxis. So knight a5. And a bigger point of b5, by the way, is to just get the pawns going and try to create a pass pawn on the c file. So queen c5, king g2, king g7, h4, a6, and e4, trying to kick that annoying knight away. But after knight c3, queen c2, b4, cementing this knight in this weakened c3 square. And another thing is that the a pawn is now kind of a huge weakness, or at least an annoying target for white to have to defend. So knight c4, breaking that pin. And Fabi actually makes a mistake, or maybe even a blunder could be considered. a5 allows the move a4, which was played in the game. And now that a2 pawn is no longer weak, it cannot be captured because the knight on c3 will hang. And white doesn't have any real weaknesses anymore, and actually white is better at this point. So bishop d4 targeting f2, queen d3, knight a2, and here both players missed the chance for knight a5, picking up a pawn, and if queen takes a5, queen d4, winning that piece back, but more importantly, the dark squares around the king are going to be a huge, huge problem. So black probably can't even take this knight and has to find some other move. So instead, white just went back to c2, knight c3, and f3. So this move equalizes, but it might be the losing move because of how much it weakens the second rank and just the king in general. So all of these squares are now kind of loose and weak. The e3 square, and it's starting to be mistake city here. Both players under a minute. Fabi plays the move knight d5. Of course you cannot take this because after c takes d, this pin is alive again, and I will be winning back my piece while pushing a pawn and making a queen. So you cannot take the knight. e3 is looking like it could be an issue. Bishop f2, knight b6, takes, knight takes a5, c5, trying to break through and promote that pawn. Black's pawns are just going to be a little bit faster than this a4 pawn. So queen f2, offering a queen trade. Queen c3, queen e2, c4, breaking through, trying to get that b pawn going. B takes c is a mistake, and it kind of makes a lot of sense why. Number one, it just automatically creates this pass pawn for black without much of a fight. It gives up this a4 pawn, and the b pawn is just very fast. Instead, queen d1 had to be played, defending here, and if takes, at least you have some sort of blockade going for you, and it's a little bit harder, although your king is still very, very weak. So after b takes c, Fabi is just winning, and he does not let go from here. So knight a4, c5, knight takes c5, queen c4, knight d3, and this knight, you know, it's not really helping here. King h3, and Fabi finds kind of the knockout blow here, a brilliant move. Queen a1, a fork of sorts. Queen h1 is a mate threat, attacking the knight as well. After king h2, there is actually a forced mate sequence that I will show. So queen b2, king h1. If knight f2 would be played here, a very, very cool finish could have happened. King g1, knight h3 check, and of course the white king cannot go to f1 because queen f2 mate. But if king h1, trying to just hide in the corner here, we again play queen a1, king h2, queen g2, or queen g1, forcing the king to that h3 square back into his tomb, and then queen h1 is mate. And again, if instead of king g1, white plays something like king g2 or king h2, knight g4 is another forced mate sequence. King f1 loses to queen f2, king h1 loses to queen h2, and king h3 also loses to queen h2. Instead, Fabi decided to just play knight e5, attacking the queen, attacking f3, forcing queen f1, and pushing the pawn. After queen c2 and queen d4, it looks like maybe white's going to get some counterplay on the dark squares here, but actually b2 is able to be played, and you get one check, and after king h2, black will promote with checkmate, and of course he will promote to a rook. So, devastating game by Fabi, just crushing win. It was a little bit back and forth, but congratulations to him. In round 8, Fabi had the white pieces against Anish Giri, and the opening was a Najdorf, which if any of you are familiar with Anish, you know that that is kind of something he specializes in. He knows very, very well, and he plays very well as well. So Fabi has an interesting strategy here. He plays the move queen d3, which is already kind of a rare move, but not only that, g3 to follow, which actually doesn't make any sense, because a lot of the times the idea attached to queen d3 is to swing the queen over to the g3 square. So these moves don't make any sense together, but that's okay, because he's trying to get Anish out of his theory and just get a chess position where he can outplay him a little bit easier. So b6, bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, e6, a4, all just normal developing moves, and queen c7, h3, g4. So the point of g4 could be a few things. You could speculate about f4 maybe being played and pushing the pawns as far as they go. I think that the main point is the f5 square. So number one, if e5 is ever played, the knight has extra support on f5, but maybe more importantly, it frees up this g3 square for the c1 knight maybe to go e2 to g3 to f5 as well. So after knight c5 attacking the queen, queen e3, e5 is played. And that move might be kind of mysterious because why would you just give white the f5 square? The point is more that black is maybe getting the d4 square for his knight and trying to break out and get rid of this weak d pawn and play d5 and open things up. But after the move knight e2, heading to g3, knight d7 is a mistake because giving up this dark squared bishop makes the d6 pawn nearly impossible to defend long term and weakens all of the dark squares. Fabi is able to give up the strong f5 knight again because he can bring the e2 knight into g3 and just replace it with a copy. So instead of knight d7, bishop f8 makes a lot more sense. Preserving that bishop, keeping d6 defended, and as an added benefit, defending all these dark squares around the king. Oftentimes when a knight and a bishop are 2 squares away from each other, one is usually dominating the other because they're controlling all the same squares. Usually the piece that's on the back rank is the one being dominated. But here it's just that they're controlling all the same squares, so it's keeping it balanced. So instead knight d7, Fabi immediately snaps that bishop off. Rook e7, rook d1, targeting this d6 pawn. Queen c3, knight g6. Black is trying to get counterplay on the f4 square. Makes sense. Rook d2, queen d8, and black's idea is to play rook d7. He wants to have the queen behind the rook to try and defend this way and break through with d5. After rook d1, rook d7, queen e3, b5. A takes b, a takes b. I feel like this b pawn is now probably a potential target as well. So another thing that white could potentially do would be bishop f1 to target this b5 pawn, and if that pawn moves, maybe the bishop comes to c4. Maybe it comes to b5 anyway, kicking this rook away. But it is just sort of a weak pawn. Fabi goes knight g3, heading in for that f5 square. Rook a2, trying to start counterplay. Bishop c3, you definitely don't want to play a move like bishop a1 because it cuts your possibilities, it cuts your options in half. So bishop c3 is a great move because it stays on this long diagonal, but it also gives you that opportunity to play bishop b4 and further build up on the d6 pawn. So knight f4, Fabi plays knight f5 here. This doesn't make, it makes sense. I think that bishop f1 is a little bit better, again, because of this idea of attacking this pawn this way, preserving the bishop pair, not allowing any trades like that, and just forcing black to respond another time and then playing knight f5. So instead, Fabi just goes knight f5 right away. Knight takes g2 makes a lot of sense to me. I don't really understand why this is bad according to the engine. For some reason, queen g5 is good. What is the threat? I suppose h5 is the idea, and black's getting counterplay. But knight takes g2 makes sense, king takes g2, d5 breaking out. We lured the king to the long diagonal also. That could be an added benefit. E takes d, rook takes d5, and here when I first saw this, I thought I saw a tactic. It doesn't work for multiple reasons, but I just saw the funny shapes in my head, so potentially rook takes d5, take everything when the queen lands here. There's knight e7, winning the queen. This doesn't work, number one, because it hangs a knight. Number two, because it hangs my king. But if the g6 knight leaves, and the king on g2 goes to h2, there are tactics available. So rook d5, bishop takes is forced, but now there's sort of an eternal pin on that bishop, and because the queen's on a dark square, it's kind of hard to get out of the pin and also keep the bishop defended. And again, tactics are afoot. So king h2, a good move, obviously, just get out of check. Rook c2, bishop takes e5, getting that last weak pawn. f6, g7 was attacked. You don't really want to play this move because you would have to resign because this is a fork. I mean f6 and I win peace. So f6 is forced. And after bishop g3, black is kind of in zugzwang. I couldn't find a move here because queen h7 is the threat, attacking g7. There's no way to interpose that queen. Bishop f7 loses your queen. The rook can't come back to c7 because of this bishop wonderfully placed on g3. And black is just lost. Giri ended up playing h6 here, which just allows queen a7, What else are you going to do? And black resigns. So a crushing victory for Fabi. Finally, in round 9, Fabi had the black pieces again, but against MVL this time. The opening went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5. This is about the most standard chess you'll ever see, so we'll just skip through here. This is very much a chess game, if you will. So a4, rook e1, knight e7. And this a5 move is the first one that's maybe not super accurate, because potentially the a5 pawn can be a target after a move like c5 if the pawn is overextended and can't be defended by something. So bishop a7, bishop e3 takes, bishop takes d4, bishop takes, queen takes, and after c5 the a5 pawn is just lost, because I have to move my queen, and it's going to take MVL way too many moves to defend this pawn. And knight c6, knight a5 is just going to happen. So castles, knight d2, knight c6, queen f4, knight takes a5, and already we're only on move 17, and white is just down a pawn and much worse. Bishop c2, knight back to c6, knight f1, queen c7, knight g3, knight e7, e5. Breaking everything open, opening this bishop up, opening the position for rooks, trying to start something. Takes, knight takes, rook e8, knight back to d3. And now this really annoying queen c6 move with a subtle threat in mind. The only ways to defend are f3 or queen f3. Queen f3, Fabi takes. The computer calls this a mistake. I think that's ridiculous. It's just a good move, because after g takes f3, positionally or strategically, black is just winning because of the control over these light squares, the superior pawn structure, and the better placed pieces. So c4, continuing to gain control over the light squares. Knight c5, bishop takes f3, and now the a pawn will be lost, but this light square control is very dangerous. So rook e3, bishop g5, maybe wanting to place the bishop on h3, ideas like that. Rook takes a6, knight d5, forcing that rook trade, and now we just go back to f3, and the king has no pawn in front of him. However, he still has no luft and still cannot breathe. So king f1, h6, knight d6, rook b8, and I think the b pawn wants to go at this point. Knight f5, bishop g5 or bishop g4, and knight d4. White missed the chance to play knight e4 here, hanging the knight, but after knight f6, bishop takes f5. The position is like slightly more balanced. Yes, white is still down a pawn, but they do have that bishop versus knight in a position where there are pawns on both sides of the board, so the long-range piece could be beneficial. And maybe the fact that the bishop's a light-squared bishop and can potentially attack these makes a difference, but that would be a better try. Instead, knight d4 is played, and after b5, black is just crashing through. So f3, I don't understand this move. I think this... I'm sure there's a point behind it. To me, it just weakens stuff. Maybe he wants to control e4? I don't really know. But b takes c is just able to be played. This bishop doesn't really matter, because after c takes b, you can't really stop promotion, because the rook can't come back, and if you move the bishop, then the other pawns coming in. Two pawns that far down the board are nearly unstoppable. So b takes c is played. Knight e3 check, king e2, knight takes, and you can't actually take on c2 here because of rook b2, and you don't have time to take because I take on c2 and then I pick up your c3 pawn, and if you do anything else, if you play king d2, bishop f5, I save my bishop, your knight is still pinned, and I build up upon it, so I just win a piece. If king d1, I just take on f3. So you have to play f takes g, knight takes d4, and now the c-pawn is just passed. The d-pawn is weak and impossible to defend, actually. The g-pawn is also going to fall. So h3, defending one pawn because that's all you can do. Rook d4, rook a4, knight d5, And now we're just securing all the pieces, over defending everything, making sure everything is just solid and defended so the job is easier. And once you do that, you can just bring in your king. So everything's defended many times. So now we bring in the king. And this was super cool. Here, Fabi played rook takes f2. The point being that after king takes f2, c2, there's no way to stop promotion, because once the rook comes back to the c file, knight b4 is a killer move, defending the pawn, attacking the rook. But more importantly, it has to do with, now that the king is on f2, no matter where the rook goes, okay, you can give me one check and then go back or something. Black can just promote. And if you take my queen, I play knight d3 check, picking up that rook once again, and black's up a piece and wins. So Fabiano scores 100% today, going into the blitz with a 3-point lead. It's often the case that whoever wins the rapid wins the whole event. It's not too late for people to catch up, but the games will start tomorrow, Saturday. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.